I remember the exact moment everything changed, though I didn't know it then. It was a Tuesday night in November, the kind where the cold seeps through the windows of our old dormitory and settles into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. The common room was nearly empty, just me and the steady hum of the ancient radiator that never quite did its job. The television flickered against the opposite wall, casting pale blue light across the worn furniture. Some late-night rerun was playing, one of those sitcoms from the 90s where the laugh track feels too loud and the jokes land with the weight of things that were funny once, maybe, to someone else. I wasn't really watching. I never was, not during these late hours when sleep felt impossible and my mind moved in circles I couldn't name. I had pulled my hoodie tight around myself, the hood up despite being indoors, creating a small cave of warmth and shadow. My textbooks lay scattered on the coffee table in front of me, abandoned hours ago when the words started blurring together and nothing made sense anymore. Psychology 201. Statistics. Literature of the American South. All the things I thought I wanted to study, all the things that felt increasingly meaningless as the semester wore on. The couch beneath me was old, probably older than I was, with cushions that had lost their shape years ago and springs that creaked whenever I shifted. But it had become familiar, this spot on the left side where I always sat, where the armrest was just the right height to lean against when the weight of the day became too much to hold upright. I was half asleep when I heard the door open. Footsteps crossed the linoleum, unhurried and sure. I didn't need to look to know it was Emery. There was something about the way he moved through space, confident but not aggressive, like he belonged wherever he decided to be. He didn't say anything when he dropped onto the couch beside me. That was typical for us, comfortable with silence, never feeling the need to fill every moment with words. The cushions dipped under his weight, and I caught the familiar scent of his laundry detergent mixed with something else, something that was just him. For a while, we both stared at the television screen. The characters were having some kind of misunderstanding that would surely be resolved by the episode's end. Everything always worked out in 22 minutes plus commercials. Real life, I had learned, was far less tidy. The cold was persistent that night, creeping through the gaps around the windows and settling in the spaces between us. I pulled my sleeves down over my hands and tucked my feet up under me, trying to create more warmth. Beside me, Emery shifted, and I caught him glancing my way, though I pretended not to notice. Then, without ceremony or explanation, he reached behind us and pulled the throw blanket from where it always lived, draped across the back of the couch. It was nothing special, some faded plaid thing that had probably been donated by someone's grandmother, but it was large enough for two people if they didn't mind being close. He didn't ask. He didn't announce what he was doing. He simply lifted the blanket and let it settle over both of us, the fabric falling across my shoulders and his, creating a shared space beneath its weight. The gesture was so casual, so matter-of-fact, that for a moment I thought I might have imagined the electricity that shot through me when the blanket touched my arms. But then I became hyper-aware of everything. The way his shoulder pressed against mine, warm and solid. The way our legs were suddenly side by side under the same cover. The way the simple act of sharing warmth felt like crossing some invisible line I hadn't even known existed. I turned toward him, my mouth already forming words. Something light, something that would acknowledge the gesture without making it bigger than it needed to be. Maybe a joke about the heating in this place, or thanks for thinking of it. Something safe. But when I looked at his face, illuminated by the television's glow, the words died in my throat. He wasn't looking at me. His eyes remained fixed on the screen, his expression unchanged, as if nothing had happened at all. As if this was the most natural thing in the world. And maybe it was. Maybe friends shared blankets all the time. Maybe I was reading meaning into something that had no meaning beyond basic human kindness and the shared desire to be warm on a cold night. But I couldn't convince myself of that. Not when every nerve in my body seemed to be paying attention to the places where we touched. His shoulder against mine. The brush of his arm when he reached for something. The way neither of us moved away, even though there was plenty of room on the couch. I tried to focus on the television, to lose myself in whatever story was unfolding there, but I was too conscious of my own breathing, too aware of the way my heart had picked up its pace. The blanket felt heavier than it should have, weighted with possibility and questions I didn't know how to ask. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time moved differently in that space beneath the blanket, in the blue-lit quiet of the common room. The radiator continued its uneven rhythm. The television cycled through commercials and back to programming. And we sat there, shoulder to shoulder, sharing warmth and silence, and something else that I couldn't name, but felt in every cell of my body. I had always been careful around Emery, careful not to let myself want too much or expect anything beyond what we already had. He was a year older, more confident, the kind of person who seemed to navigate the world with an ease I envied. Our friendship had developed slowly over the course of the semester, built on late-night conversations and shared meals and the kind of comfortable companionship that felt rare and precious. But under the blanket, in the intimacy of shared warmth, I felt something shifting, not just in me, but between us, a recognition that hung in the air like a held breath, waiting for someone to exhale. When the next commercial break came, Emery finally moved, just slightly, adjusting his position on the couch. But instead of creating distance, he seemed to settle closer, his leg pressing against mine through the fabric of our jeans. He still didn't look at me, still kept his attention on the screen, but there was something deliberate about the movement, something intentional. I stayed perfectly still, afraid that any motion might break whatever spell had fallen over us. The blanket had become our world, a small universe where the rules seemed different, where the things I usually kept buried might actually be allowed to exist. And in that moment, sitting in the half-dark with the television painting us in shifting colors, I understood that everything had changed. Not in some grand, dramatic way, but quietly, simply in the space between one breath and the next. It felt like nothing. It felt like everything. The realization settled over me with the same weight as the blanket, warm, encompassing, impossible to ignore. Whatever this was, whatever was happening between us, it was no longer something I could pretend didn't exist. The careful distance I had maintained, the walls I had built to protect myself from wanting too much, had crumbled in an instant. All because of a blanket. All because of the simple act of sharing warmth on a cold night, and the way he hadn't moved away. I have always been the kind of person who expects disappointment, not in some dramatic, self-pitying way, but as a quiet certainty that has shaped how I move through the world. I learned early that hope is a luxury I couldn't afford, that it's safer to assume the worst and be pleasantly surprised than to want something and watch it slip away. By 20, I had perfected the art of being unremarkable. I was the friend who listened more than he spoke, who laughed at other people's jokes without trying to be funnier, who faded into the background of group photos and dinner conversations. It wasn't that I was unhappy, exactly. I had learned to find a kind of peace in being invisible, in never asking for too much attention or taking up too much space. College was supposed to change that, or at least that's what everyone told me. New place, new people, fresh start. But I found myself falling into the same patterns, choosing the same spot at the back of lecture halls, eating lunch alone with a book propped against my water bottle, spending Friday nights in my dorm room while other people lived the lives they would remember when they were older. I was a psychology major because it seemed practical, though I suspected I was drawn to it for less noble reasons. There was something comforting about studying human behavior from a distance, about having clinical terms for the ways people hurt each other and themselves. It made my own careful isolation feel less like cowardice and more like observation. My statistics professor had a habit of calling on students randomly, pulling names from a hat to ensure participation. I lived in terror of hearing my name, of having 20 pairs of eyes turned toward me while I fumbled through an answer I wasn't sure was right. But I showed up anyway, took meticulous notes, turned in assignments that were competent but never brilliant. The literature of the American South class was different. I had enrolled because I needed the credit, but something about the professor's passion for the material made me want to engage. We read stories about people who were trapped by circumstances and history, who carried the weight of their families and their region like stones in their pockets. I understood those characters in a way that felt almost uncomfortable, recognizing something of myself in their quiet struggles and unspoken longings. It was in that literature class that I first really noticed Emery, though he had been in my peripheral vision for weeks. He sat 3 rows ahead of me and to the left, and he was the kind of student professors loved, engaged but not overeager, thoughtful in his responses, comfortable with silence when a question hung in the air. He was older than most of us, a junior who carried himself with the confidence of someone who had figured something out that the rest of us were still learning. Not arrogant, just sure. When he spoke in class, people listened. When he made a joke, it landed perfectly. When he disagreed with someone, he did it with such grace that they usually ended up thanking him for the perspective. I found myself paying attention to him in ways that felt dangerous. The way he tapped his pen against his notebook when he was thinking. The way he pushed his hair back when he was concentrating. The way he would catch my eye sometimes when our professor said something particularly absurd. And his small smile would make me feel like we were sharing a secret. Our friendship began accidentally, the way the best things usually do. I was sitting in the common room late one evening, surrounded by textbooks and highlighters, trying to make sense of a particularly dense chapter on cognitive behavioral therapy. Emery wandered in around midnight, probably returning from somewhere more interesting than my makeshift study session. He paused when he saw me, glanced at the mess of papers spread across the coffee table, and asked if I was cramming for the same psych exam he was dreading. I told him yes, and he asked if I wanted company. Not help. He made it clear he was probably more behind than I was, just company. That became our routine. Late nights in the common room, books open, but conversation drifting from coursework to everything else. He told me about growing up in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, about parents who loved him but didn't quite understand him, about the relief of finding a place where he could be anonymous. I told him less, but he never seemed to mind my silences or the way I deflected personal questions with jokes that weren't quite funny enough. He was easy to be around in a way that felt new to me. He never made me feel like I needed to perform or entertain or justify my presence. When I made observations about our professors or our classmates, he listened with genuine interest. When I admitted to struggling with something, he offered support without making me feel weak for needing it. There were moments, even early on, when I caught glimpses of something beneath his easy confidence. The way his smile would falter when he thought no one was looking. The careful way he spoke about his family, love mixed with something that might have been disappointment. The way he seemed to understand loneliness even though he appeared to move through the world surrounded by friends and opportunities. I told myself our friendship was exactly what it appeared to be. Two people who enjoyed each other's company, who had found a comfortable rhythm of shared time and conversation. But there was something else there, something I felt in the spaces between words, in a way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, in a way neither of us seemed eager to end our late-night talks, even when exhaustion pulled at our eyes. I was careful not to name it, this feeling that lived in the margins of our friendship. I had learned not to trust the parts of myself that wanted things I couldn't have, that saw possibility where only disappointment waited. Better to appreciate what we had than to risk losing it by wanting more. But underneath my careful restraint, something was growing. Something that felt both inevitable and impossible, like a secret I was keeping for myself. The blanket haunted me for days. Not in any dramatic way. I still went to classes, still took notes, still nodded along when professors explained theories about human behavior that felt increasingly irrelevant to my own experience. But underneath the ordinary rhythm of my days, something had shifted. A door had been opened that I couldn't quite bring myself to close. I found myself replaying the moment obsessively. The casual way Emery had reached for the blanket. The weight of it settling over both of us. The warmth that had nothing to do with fabric and everything to do with proximity. The way he had kept his eyes on the television screen, as if sharing warmth was the most natural thing in the world. Maybe it was. Maybe I was constructing meaning where none existed, the way I had learned to do in literature class, finding symbols and significance in gestures that were simply gestures, nothing more. Maybe Emery was just being kind, responding to an obvious problem with an obvious solution. The room was cold. We both needed warmth. Simple mathematics. But I couldn't shake the memory of how it felt to sit so close to him, the way every point of contact seemed to vibrate with possibility, the way neither of us had moved away, even when the blanket was large enough that we could have shared it without touching, the way the silence between us had felt heavy with things unsaid. 3 days passed before I saw him again. I told myself I wasn't avoiding him, that our schedules simply hadn't aligned, but I knew I was being careful, testing the waters of my own reaction, trying to determine if I could trust myself to be normal around him. When he appeared in the common room that Friday night, carrying a bag of microwave popcorn and wearing the same easy smile he always wore, I felt my careful composure wobble. He settled onto the couch beside me, as if nothing had changed, as if the space between us wasn't crackling with the memory of shared warmth. We talked about ordinary things, the upcoming exam in our literature class, the way our statistics professor had a habit of clicking his pen during lectures, the dining hall's latest attempt at international cuisine, which neither of us had been brave enough to try. Normal conversation, the kind we had shared dozens of times before, but I was hyper-aware of every movement he made, every shift in his position. When he leaned forward to grab the remote, his shoulder brushed against mine, and I felt the contact like an electric shock. When he laughed at something on the screen, the sound seemed to resonate in my chest in ways that had nothing to do with acoustics. The night grew later. The common room emptied around us, other students retreating to their rooms or to parties I hadn't been invited to and wouldn't have attended anyway. The radiator continued its uneven battle against the November cold, and I pulled my hoodie tighter around myself, trying to create warmth that felt increasingly elusive. I was watching him from the corner of my eye, trying to be subtle about it, when he reached behind us. My breath caught in my throat as his hand found the blanket, the same faded plaid that had occupied my thoughts for 3 days. He paused for just a moment, his fingers gripping the fabric, and I wondered if he was remembering too. If the weight of that shared moment had followed him through his days the way it had followed me through mine. Then, with the same casual confidence he had shown before, he lifted the blanket and let it fall over both of us. This time, I was ready for it. Ready for the way the fabric settled across my shoulders, for the warmth of his proximity, for the sudden intimacy of shared space. But being ready didn't make it any less overwhelming. If anything, knowing what to expect made every sensation more intense. He didn't look at me. Just as before, he kept his attention on the television screen, his expression unchanged. But there was something different in the way he settled into the couch, something more deliberate about how he positioned himself. Close enough that our shoulders touched, close enough that I could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't spontaneous kindness or practical problem-solving. He had thought about it, planned for it, chosen to recreate the moment that had been consuming my thoughts for days, which meant he had been thinking about it too. The possibility was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. For so long, I had trained myself not to hope, not to read meaning into gestures that might be meaningless. But sitting there under the shared blanket, feeling the warmth of his body beside mine, I couldn't deny what was happening between us. This was an invitation, wordless, subtle, but unmistakable. A question asked not with language, but with proximity, with the choice to recreate intimacy that could have been avoided. And I wasn't moving away. My heart hammered against my ribs as I processed this new reality. Every instinct I had developed over years of careful self-protection screamed at me to retreat, to make some excuse and return to the safety of my room, to preserve our friendship by refusing to acknowledge what it might be becoming. But I stayed, shoulder pressed against a shoulder, sharing warmth and silence and the growing weight of mutual recognition. For the first time in my life, I was choosing hope over safety, possibility over protection. The television continued its meaningless chatter, but I wasn't watching anymore. All of my attention was focused on the space where we touched, on the steady presence of him beside me, on the way this simple act of sharing a blanket had become something larger, something that felt like the beginning of everything. After that second night under the blanket, the world took on a different quality. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds more distinct. The ordinary interactions of my daily life felt muted compared to the heightened awareness that consumed me whenever Emery was near. I began to notice things I had trained myself to ignore. The way he would catch my eye across the lecture hall and hold my gaze just a moment longer than necessary. The way he positioned himself when we studied together, close enough that I could smell his soap, could see the small scar on his knuckle from some childhood accident he had never explained. The way his voice softened when he spoke directly to me, taking on a quality that felt reserved for our conversations alone. Our blanket ritual became something we both anticipated without acknowledging. Every few nights, one of us would wander into the common room and find the other already there. And somehow the evening would end with us sharing that same faded plaid, our bodies pressed together in the name of warmth and comfort. But it was more than warmth now. Under that blanket, the carefully maintained boundaries of our friendship began to blur. Small touches that could be explained as accidents, but felt anything but accidental. The brush of his fingers when he reached for something. The way he would shift in his sleep, because we had started falling asleep there, heads tilted toward each other, breathing synchronized, and his hand would end up resting against my arm, my leg, once memorably against the curve of my shoulder. I told myself these moments meant nothing while simultaneously cataloging every sensation, every point of contact, storing them away like precious things I might need to remember later. The weight of his head when it dropped against my shoulder during a particularly boring late-night movie. The way his breathing would slow and deepen when he dozed, and how I would stay perfectly still, afraid to wake him and end the intimacy of the moment. One Thursday night in early December, we were watching some nature documentary about Arctic foxes. The narrator's voice was hypnotic, all measured cadences and British authority, and the footage of snow-covered landscapes made our own cold common room feel almost tropical by comparison. Emery had made coffee in the small kitchenette, and we shared the single mug between us because all the others were dirty and neither of us wanted to break the mood by washing dishes. I was hyper-aware of the fact that we were drinking from the same cup, that his lips had touched the rim moments before mine did. It felt intimate in a way that sharing a blanket somehow didn't, more deliberate and personal. When I handed the mug back to him and our fingers brushed in the exchange, I felt the contact all the way to my toes. He was sitting closer that night, close enough that I could feel the rise and fall of his chest, could count his heartbeats if I concentrated. The documentary droned on about survival adaptations and mating rituals, and I found myself thinking about the parallels, about the careful dance we had been performing for weeks now. When a commercial break came, Emery reached for the remote to mute the television. But instead of settling back into his previous position, he shifted, angling his body toward mine. The movement was subtle, probably invisible to anyone who wasn't paying obsessive attention to his every gesture, but to me it felt seismic. I could see more of his face now, the way the blue light from the screen played across his features. His eyes, which I had always thought were brown, revealed flecks of gold and green in the artificial twilight. His mouth, which I had been trying not to look at for weeks, was slightly parted as if he were about to say something. But he didn't speak. Instead, he studied my face with an intensity that made my breath catch. This wasn't the casual glance of a friend or the polite attention of a study partner. This was something else entirely, a look that felt like a question and a confession all at once. I should have looked away. Everything I had learned about self-preservation told me to break the moment, to laugh or make a joke or find some excuse to escape before whatever was building between us could reach its conclusion. But I couldn't move. I was caught in his gaze like a moth in amber, terrified and exhilarated and utterly unable to protect myself. Time moved differently in that space under the blanket. Seconds stretched into minutes, or maybe it was the reverse. The only sound was the hum of the radiator and the distant noise of other students moving through the dormitory, living their uncomplicated lives beyond our small cocoon of warmth and possibility. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, and I had to lean closer to hear him. The coffee mug, I told him I would wash it later. He said he didn't mind if I didn't, that he liked the idea of our coffee rings overlapping on the ceramic, permanent proof that we had shared something. The words themselves were innocent enough, but the way he said them, the weight he gave to the concept of sharing, made them feel heavy with meaning. I felt my face warm, felt something flutter in my chest that had nothing to do with caffeine. And then, without breaking eye contact, he did something that changed everything. He lifted his hand and brushed a strand of hair back from my forehead, his fingers lingering against my skin for just a moment longer than necessary. The touch was gentle, almost reverent, and completely impossible to misinterpret. This wasn't the accidental contact we had been pretending to ignore for weeks. This was intentional, deliberate, a crossing of the line we had been dancing around since that first night under the blanket. My eyes fluttered closed at the contact, and when I opened them again, he was still watching me, still close enough that I could feel his breath against my skin. The silence between us was no longer empty. It was full of recognition, of acknowledgement, of the admission that what we had been calling friendship had become something else entirely. The touch lingered between us like a held breath, his fingers still warm against my forehead where he had brushed away that strand of hair. I could feel my pulse in places I'd never noticed before, my throat, my wrists, behind my ears. The documentary continued its narration about survival in impossible conditions. But the only impossible thing I could focus on was the way Emery was looking at me, as if he were memorizing my face in the blue-lit darkness. When he finally pulled his hand back, I felt the absence of his touch like a physical ache. But he didn't retreat entirely. Instead, he settled back against the couch, still angled toward me, the blanket creating a private world around us that felt separate from everything else. We returned to watching the screen, but the pretense felt thinner now, more transparent. I was acutely aware of every shift in his breathing, every small movement he made. When he reached for the coffee mug again, his arm brushed against mine, and neither of us pulled away. When he handed it back to me, our fingers overlapped deliberately, and I felt brave enough to let the contact linger for a moment longer than necessary. The documentary ended, fading to credits that neither of us acknowledged. Another program began, something about deep-sea creatures that moved through darkness with their own internal light. I found myself thinking about metaphors, about the way some things could only be seen clearly in the absence of conventional illumination. It was then that the blanket began to slip. The movement was gradual at first, the fabric sliding slowly off my shoulder as I shifted to get more comfortable. I reached to pull it back without thinking, my hand catching the edge of the plaid material. But before I could adjust it, Emery's hand covered mine. The contact was immediate and electric. His palm was warm against the back of my hand, his fingers longer than mine, pressing gently but firmly against my skin. For a moment, neither of us moved. We simply sat there, hands layered together, the blanket forgotten between us. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, so loud I was certain he could hear it. The rational part of my mind, the part that had spent weeks analyzing and explaining away every meaningful moment between us, scrambled for an interpretation that would make this safe, innocent, easily dismissed. But there was no dismissing the way his thumb moved across my knuckles, a small deliberate motion that sent electricity shooting up my arm. There was no explaining away the way he shifted closer, closing the small distance that had remained between us until our knees were touching through the fabric of our jeans. When he spoke, his voice was different than I had ever heard it. Lower, rougher around the edges, as if the words were costing him something to say. "I like this," he said, and the simplicity of the statement hit me like a physical blow. I like this. Present tense, immediate, undeniable. He paused, and I watched his throat work as he swallowed, gathering courage for whatever came next. "I like you," he said, and the words hung in the air between us like something fragile and precious, something that could shatter if I breathed wrong or moved too quickly. The confession was so simple, so direct, that for a moment I couldn't process it. I had imagined this moment in dozens of different ways over the past weeks. Dramatic declarations, passionate speeches, scenes pulled from the romance novels I had read in secret as a teenager. But this quiet honesty was more powerful than any fantasy I had constructed. "I like you." 3 words that changed everything, that transformed weeks of careful interpretation and cautious hope into something real and present and utterly terrifying. My breath came out in a rush, taking with it all the air I seemed to have been holding in my lungs for weeks. I stared at our joined hands, at the way his fingers had interlaced with mine without either of us planning it, and felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. The fear was still there, the old familiar terror of wanting something too much, of being vulnerable in ways that could destroy me. But underneath, it was something else, something that felt like relief. Like the exhale after holding your breath for so long you had forgotten what normal breathing felt like. He was still watching me, waiting for some kind of response, and I could see the uncertainty creeping into his expression. The same fear I was feeling reflected back at me, the awareness that he had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had spoken words that couldn't be taken back. I wanted to say something profound, something that would match the weight of his confession. But when I opened my mouth, what came out was simpler than that. "I know," I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, hoarse and unsteady. "I know. I like you too." The admission felt like stepping off a cliff, like free falling into something I couldn't control or predict. But as soon as the words left my mouth, I felt the rightness of them, the relief of finally speaking something I had been carrying around for weeks like a secret I was keeping for myself. His eyes searched my face, looking for confirmation, for certainty, for some sign that I meant what I was saying. And I realized that this was what courage looked like, not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The revelation settled between us like something solid and real. The warmth I had been feeling, the electricity of our shared touches, the weight of meaningful glances, none of it had been one-sided. None of it had been wishful thinking or misinterpreted kindness. He felt it too, had been feeling it, carrying it, protecting it just as carefully as I had been. Under the blanket in the blue-lit quiet of the common room, we sat with our hands joined and our confessions hanging in the air between us, both of us breathing a little too fast, both of us trying to process the magnitude of what had just shifted between us. Everything was different now. Everything was just beginning. The words hung between us like something fragile and new, still reverberating in the quiet space under the blanket. "I like you too." The admission felt both enormous and insufficient. 3 small words trying to contain weeks of accumulated longing, of careful observation, of hope I had been afraid to acknowledge even to myself. Our hands were still joined, his fingers warm and solid against mine, and I found myself studying the places where we connected. The way his thumb rested against my knuckle, the slight tremor I could feel in his grip, as if he too was struggling to process the magnitude of what we had just shared. For a moment, we simply existed in that space of mutual recognition, both of us breathing a little too carefully, both of us aware that we had stepped across a threshold that would change everything between us. The television continued its exploration of deep-sea creatures, but the only depths I could think about were the ones I saw in his eyes when I finally found the courage to look at him directly. There was something different in his expression now, a vulnerability I had glimpsed before but never seen so openly displayed. The careful confidence he usually wore like armor had softened, revealing something raw and uncertain underneath. He looked younger somehow, more fragile, as if his confession had stripped away layers of protection he had been carrying without realizing it. I understood the feeling. My own defenses felt paper-thin, inadequate barriers against the intensity of what was building between us. Every instinct I had developed over years of careful self-preservation screamed at me to retreat, to find some way to return to the safety of friendship, to protect what we had instead of risking it for what we might become. But I couldn't move, couldn't pull my hand away from his or create distance between us or make the joke that would defuse the tension and return us to familiar territory. Because underneath the fear was something stronger, something that felt like recognition, like coming home to a place I had been searching for without knowing I was lost. He shifted beside me, angling his body more fully toward mine, and I felt the warmth of his leg pressing against mine through the fabric of our jeans. The contact was deliberate, unmistakable, and it sent heat racing through my veins in ways that had nothing to do with the blanket covering us. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, and I had to lean closer to hear him. The movement brought our faces near enough that I could see the gold flecks in his eyes, could count the individual lashes that framed them. "I've been thinking about this for weeks," he said, and the confession hit me like a physical blow. Weeks, which meant this feeling, this awareness, this careful dance we had been performing, it hadn't been one-sided. He had been carrying the same weight I had been carrying, protecting the same secret, wondering the same impossible things. The knowledge was overwhelming and liberating in equal measure. All those moments I had convinced myself I was imagining, the meaningful glances, the deliberate touches, the way our friendship had taken on a quality that felt different from anything I had experienced before, they had been real. They had meant what I hoped they meant. But with recognition came choice, and I could see the weight of that choice reflected in his expression. We could acknowledge what was between us and see where it led, or we could step back, pretend this conversation had never happened, return to the safety of what we had been before. The option was there, visible in the careful way he held himself, in the tremor in his voice when he spoke. He was giving me an escape route, a way to preserve what we had if I wasn't ready for what we might become. I should have taken it. Every rational part of my mind knew that crossing this line would change everything between us, that there would be no returning to the easy friendship we had built if whatever came next didn't work. I should have been thinking about the practical complications, the risk of losing not just him, but the entire social circle we shared, the possibility that this intensity between us was nothing more than proximity and loneliness, and the particular vulnerability that came with late nights and shared confidences. But as I sat there looking at him, feeling the warmth of his hand in mine and the weight of his confession settling around us like a second blanket, I realized I didn't want safety anymore. I was tired of protecting myself from disappointment, tired of choosing security over possibility, tired of living in the margins of my own life. He leaned closer, and I could feel his breath against my skin, warm and unsteady. His free hand lifted to cup my face, his thumb tracing the line of my cheekbone with infinite gentleness. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, and the words were both invitation and question, permission and plea. For a heartbeat, I hesitated. This was the moment, the choice that would determine everything that came after. I could feel the weight of it, the way it balanced on the edge of my response. But when I opened my mouth, the words that came out surprised us both. "I don't want you to stop," I said, and my voice was steadier than I felt, more certain than I had any right to be. He searched my face for doubt, for hesitation, for any sign that I didn't mean what I was saying. But what he found there must have satisfied him, because his thumb moved across my cheekbone again, and then he was leaning closer, close enough that our foreheads touched, close enough that the space between us felt electric with possibility. The moment stretched, suspended between intention and action, between want and fulfillment. And then, with infinite care, as if I were something precious that might break, he closed the distance between us and kissed me. The kiss was soft, tentative, a question asked with lips instead of words. For a moment that stretched like eternity, we remained suspended in that space between friendship and something else entirely, his mouth warm against mine, both of us breathing carefully as if sudden movement might shatter whatever spell had fallen over us. When we finally separated, it was only by inches. Our foreheads remained touching, our breath mingling in the small space between us, and I could feel the rapid flutter of his pulse where my hand had somehow found its way to rest against his throat. The television continued its documentary about creatures that lived in darkness, their own light guiding them through depths where no external illumination could reach. I thought about how fitting that seemed, how we had found our way to each other not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through the small accumulated lights of shared moments, gentle touches, and the gradual recognition of something that had been growing between us all along. Neither of us spoke. Words felt unnecessary now, inadequate to capture what had just shifted between us. Instead, we settled back against the couch, and Emery pulled the blanket higher around our shoulders, creating a cocoon that felt both protective and intimate. I rested my head against his shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing, the warmth of his body through the fabric of his shirt. His arm came around me naturally, as if we had been sitting like this for years instead of experiencing it for the first time. The common room around us remained unchanged. The same worn furniture, the same flickering fluorescent light above the kitchenette, the same radiator humming its uneven rhythm against the December cold. But within the circle of our shared warmth, everything felt transformed. I closed my eyes and let myself sink into the sensation of being held, of being chosen, of having taken the terrifying leap from wanting to having and discovering that the landing was softer than I had ever dared to hope. For so long, I had lived in the careful space between desire and disappointment, never allowing myself to want anything too much for fear of losing it. But this, his steady heartbeat under my ear, the weight of his arm around me, the lingering taste of our first kiss, this felt real in a way that transcended fear. It felt like something worth the risk, worth the vulnerability, worth the possibility of pain that always accompanied the possibility of joy. Time moved differently in that space under the blanket. Minutes could have been hours, or hours could have been minutes. The documentary ended and another program began, but we weren't watching anymore. We were learning the new geography of this thing between us, the way our bodies fit together, the rhythm of shared silence that felt more intimate than any conversation we had ever had. At some point, Emery's fingers found mine again, interlacing in a gesture that felt both familiar and entirely new. I studied our joined hands in the blue light from the television, marveling at how something so simple could carry so much weight, so much meaning. He shifted slightly, and I felt his lips brush against the top of my head, a kiss so gentle it might have been accidental if not for the way his arm tightened around me afterward, pulling me closer against his side. I thought about all the nights we had spent in this same room, on this same couch, sharing this same blanket. How we had been building toward this moment through dozens of small choices, each one bringing us incrementally closer to the recognition of what we were to each other. The fear was still there, humming underneath my contentment like a bass note I couldn't quite ignore. The knowledge that everything had changed, that we could never go back to the safe simplicity of friendship, that whatever came next would require courage I wasn't sure I possessed. But stronger than the fear was something else, something that felt like peace. Like coming home after a long journey I hadn't realized I was taking. Like finding the answer to a question I had been asking my whole life without knowing how to form the words. Outside, I could hear the distant sounds of campus life continuing around us. Students returning from parties, voices echoing in the hallways, the rumble of late-night traffic on the street beyond our dormitory. The world was carrying on exactly as it always had, unaware that something fundamental had shifted in this small corner of it. But inside our cocoon of shared warmth, time felt suspended. We existed in our own small universe, governed by the rhythm of our breathing, the steady beat of his heart against my ear, the way his thumb moved in slow circles across my knuckles. I had never understood before why people wrote songs about moments like this, why poets spent lifetimes trying to capture the feeling of perfect contentment. But sitting there with Emery's arms around me, feeling more myself than I had ever felt, while simultaneously feeling completely transformed, I began to comprehend the inadequacy of language to contain certain experiences. Some things could only be felt, only lived, only remembered in the body's own vocabulary of sensation and emotion. When I finally opened my eyes, the television screen showed two figures silhouetted against an underwater landscape, moving together through depths that would have been impossible to navigate alone. The image felt like a benediction, a promise, a glimpse of what we might become if we were brave enough to keep swimming toward each other in the darkness. The blanket covered us both, our shared warmth creating a small pocket of summer in the middle of winter. And in that moment, surrounded by his steady presence and the quiet certainty that everything had changed, I felt something I had never quite believed in before. I felt safe enough to hope.